Well, happy Sabbath, everybody. Did you all recuperate from the unleavened bread? It seemed like I haven't. It's like I haven't seen you for a month, and yet it's only been a week. Actually, last Friday, we went down to, of course, San Jose last Sabbath. And we'll run down to San Jose again this Sabbath as well. Of course, looking very much forward to the conference at the beginning of the month. It seems like that things are, again, coming on us very, very fast. It won't be long before it'll be warm and you'll be complaining about how hot it is. So anyway, hopefully it won't get too hot, though, in this area. That's one of the nice things about the Bay Area, isn't it? The temperatures tend to be moderated by the fog that creates sort of an air conditioning system. I guess that's why there are 8 million people live here, and more people would like to live here probably. I'm going to ask a question here to begin the message today. What if from birth you wasted entirely your life? From the time you were born, you wasted your life in all manner of useless things. You ignored work. It's like a four-letter word to some people. You practiced every sin possible by a human being, like they say, wine, women, and song. Or if you're a woman, wine, men, and song. And you did it just every day of your life. That's what you did in your life. Let me ask you this. Do you think that would be a crime against God for you to do that? To live your life that way? To live a purposely unfulfilled life, I think, would be a crime against God. Because it is, in fact, something contrary to the creation that God made when He brought human beings into existence. Because God created human beings for, as we have said many, many times before, from this very pulpit, that God has a transcendental purpose for mankind. That all human beings were created for a great purpose. To be a part of God's family. And our lives are to prepare for that future that we're going to have. Now, I've mentioned about, again, what if you wasted your life? What is God's view of you now and what you've done with your life? Concerning your own fulfillment of your mission and calling on life. Again, fulfilling this transcendental purpose that God has for all of us to be a part of His family. I want to talk about, in the course of the sermon today, I've been thinking about this for a couple of weeks, and it sort of gelled and came together this week, is are we living our calling and mission in life? Are you living? I want to make it personal to you. But again, anytime I'm up here, I'm talking to myself as well. But are you living your calling and mission in life? How are you doing with it? Most of us wonder, well, why did God call me? Did God look for anything when He decided He was going to call you now at this time? How is it possible that you could be seated here in the midst of God's people today? Well, we know it says in John 6:44, it says, no man could come to me except the Father draw him. So somewhere along the line, we caught the Father's attention, didn't we? And that's why we're here. And there is no other way in which a person, in fact, can be here with God's people unless they're being drawn of the Father to Jesus Christ. And by being drawn to Jesus Christ, we're naturally drawn to His church. Christ, because Christ is here. Christ is the head of the church. We are told in Revelation that He walks in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. And so he's right involved in the church. So that's why the church, again, is very important when it comes to be drawn to Christ. And so the Father in heaven, brethren, thought about you, particularly you, before you were drawn to Jesus Christ. He did not do that capriciously. He didn't do it just like that. He thought about you. He had a place for you in mind when he decided he was going to draw you to Christ. A place in the church. Because it says he places us in the church as it pleases him. Now let's go over to Ephesians chapter 5. We just, of course, observe the Passover, which looks to the sacrifice of Christ and what Christ did for us. But here, Paul says in verse 1 and 2, we'll just look at these two verses, "Therefore be imitators of God as dear children." And so we're told to imitate God. And so that's our paragon that we are to imitate. We ought to walk as dear children in our lives and fulfilling that mission that God has given to us. In verse 2, "And walk in love as Christ also has loved us." So as we live in our lives, as we walk with God, we ought to walk even as Jesus Christ walked. And we ought to love because Christ loved us. Love should, in fact, define us. But notice, "and gave himself for us." And so he gave himself for us as an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. So he was like that sacrifice that Aaron and his sons and the priest put on the altar of God that ascended to God. But Christ was that sweet-smelling incense in the nostrils of God. And so Jesus Christ, brethren, gave of himself for us to call us. And so a great big price, brethren, has been paid for you and me, that we could be called into the church today, so that our sins could be forgiven. And Christ again made that possible. But God saw in you, brethren, traits that he desired within his church. Now there were traits that he put in us, through his own creation of us. And those traits, by the way, some of them latent, he would have to develop through the Holy Spirit, which would take time. And how does he do that? He does that by allowing us to go through trials in our lives. He wants us, brethren, to be people who are on a mission in our lives and a calling. And there is an end to the road here. There's a ribbon across the finish line for the future. This race does not go on forever and ever for us. It is, again, a lifetime that we spend in striving to fulfill that mission and that goal in our lives, but we should be on a definite mission. It is a mission of God. Now I want to talk to you, brethren, about this. I want to talk to you about what it means, brethren, what it means to be, in fact, somebody who is seriously, purposely walking according to God's laws and is on a purposeful walk, on a purposeful mission in life. How were God's people supposed to be? How are God's servants supposed to be? Sometimes I think our brethren don't grasp these things as they should. Sometimes I've been very disappointed, brethren, in what I see people not doing in their lives. I remember when I came into the church, brethren, there was a lot more. People had a lot more get up and go. A lot more vim and vigor. Of course, we were all younger in those days, weren't we? That may have had something to do with it. But I remember when people would come to church, though, and they would have their Bibles with them, and they'd have a notepad, and they'd be writing down things that they were hearing. And they really earnestly wanted to live a certain way of life. They wanted to hear all about it. They wanted to hear all about it. somewhere along the line, we've lost that. Sometimes I see people come to church, they don't even have a Bible. I guess they got it memorized, huh? No, I don't think so. But what are the characteristics, brethren? What are the traits of a true servant of God? I don't mean that you got to have a notebook, you got to write down everything the minister says, everything that is said in the congregation. It'd be a good idea to write down at least a few ideas that were presented on the Sabbaths and the holy days so that we could give an answer to somebody who says, hey, what was the message about? Well, I don't know, but I had a good sandwich. Not such a good idea during the days of unleavened bread. But what are the traits, brethren, that we ought to be having as God's servants? Well, I got 5 traits I want to talk about here today with you, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one of them, but I think they're very important traits. Number 1 thing, brethren, is the servants of God are deeply loyal to God. They're loyal to God. It's like in a marriage, you think about a wife or a husband, they're faithful, aren't they? They're loyal to their mate. When maybe he's turning his head, his wife's not out flirting with somebody else. Or when she's turning her head, he's out flirting with somebody else. But God is a jealous God. The Bible actually says that. But God's servants, brethren, those who are on a mission in life, a purpose in life, are loyal to God. Let's go over here to 1 Kings chapter 18. 1 Kings chapter 18. What if when you propose to your wife, men, that you said to her, I love you. You are like the rising and the setting of the sun to me. Your lips, are so wonderful to me. And I want to be with you for the rest of my life. And he pauses a little bit and expects maybe her to say a few things about it. And she says, thanks. She doesn't say anything about loving him and caring for him. That's what you call, I guess, an unrequited love, isn't it? But sometimes we can be that way to God. God says, I love you so much, I'm going to lay my son on the line, and he's going to give his life for you. I give you my only begotten son, just for you. Do you love me? God says. And again, what is our answer? What are we willing to do in return for God? What did ancient Israel do? Well, Israel was involved in dilly-dallying with every nation that came along. Every god that came along, it seemed like they were torn away from God so easily. In 1 Kings chapter 18, down in verse 21, let's notice here. Here he was contending with the prophets of Baal, and he was contending with King Ahab and old Jezebel. What a name, Jezebel. But anyway, and here in verse 21 of 1 Kings 18, and Elijah came to all the people, these are the people of Israel, and he said, how long will you falter between two opinions? If the eternal is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. But the people answered him not a word. You'd think, after God delivered Israel from Egypt and he performed all these miracles, with that, it would be a rallying cry from Elijah, and the people said, yes, Elijah, let's stand for God. Let's this whole nation stand for God. Let's throw these Baalites out the door, But of course, that's not what happened. Well, they said, they're like that woman who was told by her, future mate, I love you so much, but she said, thank you. But they said not a word here. But notice going on, then Elijah said to the people, I alone am left a prophet of the eternal. But Baal's prophets are 450 men. It is amazing, isn't it? We think here in the Oakland congregation we have a lot of elders. But really we're few in number, aren't we? You know, we got just a few elders here. And look at all of the prophets of Baal right here in the Oakland area. You probably couldn't number them. I mean, they got every variety too. They got men, women, they got, I'm talking about ministers, of course. People claiming to be ministers. You got probably transsexual ministers. You got all kinds of variety. Women ministers, whatever is here in the area. Of course, all of those contrary to God's law to begin with. But here, in this case, you know, God reveals through us, through what is here in Kings, that Elijah thought he was the only one. Actually, he wasn't the only one, was he? Because there were other prophets, there were other servants of God. Remember, there were true servants that were preserved during this time. But Elijah, for all practical purposes, seemed like he was the only one. But God told him, he said, look, I've got 7,000 people that haven't bent their knee to Baal. So there were other people. But you know, they weren't vocal. Apparently, they weren't to be heard in this particular case. But what do we find here in this particular situation here? He says, how long are you going to falter between two opinions? If God is God, then serve him. If it's Baal, well, then serve him. And of course, in the chapter 18 here, we find what happened here, that it became very clear that Baal worship was of no value whatsoever. You know, the prophets of Baal, as we know, they were crying out to Baal for things. They were throwing themselves on the altar. They were cutting themselves. They were bellowing, to their false god, and nothing happened. And all Elijah does is lift up his eyes to heaven and pray a small prayer. And boy, there's a, what is it, atomic fire that consumes the entire altar, not just the sacrifice, but the altar itself. Apparently the stones, everything was just consumed. It was gone. It's like it had been beamed up, in the starship, or something like that. But, I'm just getting a little tricky here on you, but I don't know what God did. I have no idea what he did. He can do anything he wants, of course. So the prophets of God are deeply loyal. There's no fence sitting. You can't sit on the fence. And God's servants, brethren, can't sit on the fence. You can't say, well, I think, I like United Church of God, but I like this group over here too. It's either one or the other. You got to get off the fence. You can't do a work in two different places. You got to get involved in the church and what's going on, having on the garments of involvement as God's people. And by that, I'm not saying that there aren't other people. Even as Elijah didn't know, I'm sure there are many people that are God's people. We just don't know them all. God knows his own, but you're no expert. I'm no expert about that. But I know you are the people of God. I know that. And I really believe it very firmly. But we see that Elijah didn't sit on the fence. Of course, he paid the price, doesn't he? He ended up running from Jezebel and other things. He was ostracized in the kingdom and chased down and whatnot. But God always protected him. I think that's another thing that's very interesting. If we stand for God, if we apply ourselves in being loyal to God as the servants of God, living a purposeful mission in life. Let's go over to John 5. John chapter 5. to show you again, not only, brethren, do we see again the loyalty, in Elijah, we see the same kind of loyalty in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ did not come to seek his own. In verse 19 here, in John chapter 5, in verse 19, it says, "Then Jesus answered and said to them, Most assuredly I say to you that the Son of Man can do nothing of himself." Didn't come with the attitude of claiming all this power himself. He said, "I can't do anything of myself. But what he sees the Father do, for whatever he does, the Son also does in like manner." So he was deeply, deeply loyal to the Father. He was loyal to God. In verse 30, let's notice over here. Again, he says, "I can of myself do nothing. As I hear, I judge. And my judgment is righteous, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me." So Christ set the example, brethren, for all servants on a mission, is to be loyal to God no matter what. And so, brethren, if I can get across this one point to you, loyalty, brethren, is very important if we're on a mission and we're going to fulfill our calling in life. Don't think you're going to fulfill your calling if you're not loyal. If you're not loyal to God. You're not consistent, in fact, in that loyalty. Over in John 13, I don't want to take a lot of time with this because we've already covered this in messages during certainly the Passover. But here in John 13, down in verse 21, we remember that Jesus was saying that night of the Passover, he said in verse 21, and when Jesus said these things, he said he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Most assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me." One of you is going to betray me. You see, if that streak of loyalty is not there, brethren, in us, that trait of loyalty, we will betray eventually. The time will come where we will turn our backs on God. It happened to Israel. It can happen to us too. But verse 22, then the disciples looked at one another, perplexed about of whom he spoke. Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of the disciples whom Jesus loved. And Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask who it was of whom he spoke. And then leaning back on Jesus' breast, he said to him, "Lord, who is it?" And Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it." And have dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now after the piece of bread, Satan entered him, and then Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." It's interesting that around the Passover here, when he took that bread, and he had those bad intents in his heart, it was a signal for the devil to enter Judas. And Judas becomes, rather than the epitome that Jesus was of loyalty, he became the epitome of betrayal. So, brother, it's important, first of all, to always make sure our heart is right when we partake of the Passover. Because if it's not, we do it all, disobey God in that way, and we're not partaking of that Passover with a right heart, we have evil intent in our heart. In other words, Satan can enter in and begin to take advantage of us. And again, we could follow the example, unfortunately, set by here the epitome of disloyalty, the epitome of betrayal, Judas Iscariot. But of course, we want to be like Christ. We want to walk in his steps and be, following the epitome of loyalty. Another trait, brethren, that those who are on a mission, in a calling, those who are going to fulfill that mission, is number 2, if you're writing them down, is a servant of God follows instructions. A servant of God follows instructions. Anciently, God found in one man somebody who could follow instructions. And he was so faithful in what he did, he was called the father of the faithful. And you know the story in Genesis 12. I'm not going to go over there, but in Genesis 12, God told a man named Abram, who dwelt, by the way, in one of the most modern areas of the world at the time. He dwelt in Ur of the Chaldees, and that was a modern city, by the way. It had streets, it had sewage, it had, places to live. But God told him, he said, I want you to go to a place I'm going to show you. And as you know, God asked him to go to the land of Canaan. Now, Canaan was not such a place as Ur. Canaan would be a place where he'd have to dwell in tents. Different world, different lifestyle. How many of you like to camp out, by the way? I mean, that you really love camping out? Okay. Some people say that their idea of camping out is a bad Holiday Inn. But some people are not keen on camping out. Well, Abram was going to have to do a lot of camping out. Different world all together. But God said, I want you to leave your family and go to this place. And of all things, Abraham didn't quibble with God. He just simply did it. Now, in Genesis 17, I'm not going to go there, but just in verse 1 or there, God said to Abram, he said, I want you to walk before me, and I want you to be perfect. And he said, if you will be perfect, I'll make you the father of nations, many peoples. So we have these promises that God made to Abraham if he was faithful. And how did he prove, by the way, that, he was faithful? Well, God says, walk before me and be perfect. Walk before me and be perfect. And we find a little bit later, as in Genesis 26, verse 5, that God said, because Abraham obeyed my voice, he kept my commandments, statutes, and judgments. So he observed God's law. He walked in God's laws before God. That's what it means to, again, walk before God and be perfect. And over a course of time, God began to look at Abraham. He changed his name, to Abraham, meaning father of nations, many nations. In fact, his wife's name was changed as well. But later, God was going to test him. In Genesis 22, God was going to test him. In verses 1 through 3 there, it talks about how that he said, I want you to take your son, whom he had promised to him, Isaac, and I want you to sacrifice him. Take him to a place and sacrifice him. We know he was taken to Mount Moriah, from what we understand, the place where the Dome of the Rock is, in fact, right now, in Jerusalem. And God said, I want you to sacrifice him. And what did Abraham do? Again, he followed instructions of what God had said. And he took Isaac, and he went to a place, and he fully intended to do what God had said. Now, you can read a little bit over in Hebrews 11 and verse 9, and it says that when he was asked to do this difficult thing, it would have been a very, very difficult thing to sacrifice your only son that you had waited all of your life. Here Abraham was 100 years old. He was older than that at this particular time because Isaac was a probably a young man, maybe is 16 or 17 years of age at this time. And of course, Abraham's, son, he loved greatly. God wanted, I think God wanted Abraham to know what it's like to give your son, to feel that loss. And here we see the scene in Genesis 22, how he raises his knife. He's going to sacrifice his son. And God tells him, no, don't do it. But in Hebrews it says that on the way he was committed to do it, and it says he concluded that God would raise Isaac from the dead because of what he had promised him. And so he realized God was in charge. And we know after that, there in Genesis 22, God said, now I know. Since you have not withheld your only son, I can bring to pass all the things I've said about you, Abraham, to make him into a great people, many nations, many kings that would come out of him. As the Bible talks about for him and his wife, Sarah. And so you see a servant of God, and we see this pattern all the way through the Bible. A servant of God follows instructions. Follows instructions. Now we give I've mentioned to you about Forrest Gump. No, Forrest Gump, by the way, in the movie, he's sort of what is the word? Mentally challenged. To be, we've got to be careful because we've got to be politically correct today in what we say. But he was mentally challenged. Very slow type of individual. Had a lot of good qualities Mother instilled in him. But he was very slow, and he was mentally challenged. But the whole movie, by the way, there are parts of it are not good, but the whole movie, basically, he is always falling into great accomplishments. And he's a fictitious character, obviously. But it's an interesting story. But one of the things that was so interesting is when he went to Vietnam, and he was decorated for going to Vietnam, and he had his lieutenant, was it Lieutenant Dan, that asks him, talks to him, and he said, how in the world did you do all that? And he said, Lieutenant Dan, he says, I just did what you told me to do. Well, I think there's a lesson there for us, isn't it? Because when it comes before our great Creator God, as we stand before God, we're a lot like Forrest Gump, aren't we? We're a little mentally challenged when it comes to dealing with our great Creator. And so all we have to do is do what He tells us to do. And things will go well for us in our life, but when we start concluding God didn't know what He's talking about, well, then you're going to get in trouble. We're here in 1 Samuel chapter 15. But the last 6,000 years, though, brethren, the story of man is, in fact, deciding God didn't know what He was talking about. And that's what has gotten man in trouble so much. But in 1 Samuel chapter 15 over here, and we use this example quite often, but I think it really demonstrates this point rather well. And Samuel also said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you king over His people, over Israel. Now therefore heed the voice of the words of the Eternal. In other words, follow His instructions. Follow what God says. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel. See, God's a great judge, and He's very fair. Amalek treated Israel very badly. And God is the judge. He's the one that makes the judgments on people, and He judged Amalek needed to be punished. How He ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. The most vulnerable time of Israel's existence. Here they were people coming out of Egypt that did not have weapons. All they had was probably hand tools or whatever that were used to farm, which would have probably not helped them at all in fighting, with Amalek, which was more developed. But he said, now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. And the story and the account here, you may wonder, well, why would God want, little children to be killed? Well, because of the way that oftentimes peoples like this are. If we knew what was going on in some of the schools over in the Middle East, among the Arab world, we would be shocked. We really would. Where little kids, brethren, are being taught in the Muslim religion to hate Israel, consider them monkeys, consider them, less than dung, basically. It's all right to kill them. And not only that, they're taught to kill Christians, anybody that is not a Muslim. And in fact, if you are a Muslim, if you're not a faithful Muslim, to kill them too. And so this is the mentality that Amalek would have had. But because Israel did not follow God's instructions about some of these people, they were a continual thorn in the side of Israel. Better to just put it behind you than to always have to be dealing with. That's why, of course, over in Israel right now today, there's a big problem in the Middle East because Israel didn't take care of following God's instructions and what he said. And you know how that Saul didn't follow instructions. And because he did not follow instructions, let's go over here to verse 26. Verse 26. Here, notice in verse 26, but Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Eternal, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. Do you get what he's saying here, brethren? If we reject God's instructions, if we don't follow instructions, God will reject us. It's not just the matter he rejects kings. He rejects us if we reject the knowledge that he has given to us. And it says, and as Samuel turned around to go away, Saul seized the edge of his robe, and it is torn. And so Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. Better than you. And then, of course, that neighbor he was talking about was none other than David. And David took care of business. And you know what happened to Israel? Israel became so huge. It was, of course, by the time of Solomon, it was a huge empire and influence in the world. Often unnoticed, in fact, by historians, by the way, of how powerful Israel had become. And God made them that way. But David was somebody who obeyed God, who fulfilled God's instructions, what God said. Now let's go over here to 1 Kings chapter 13. We all know the story, by the way, of Jeroboam, about how Jeroboam, during the days of after the death of Solomon, and when Rehoboam became king, that Jeroboam became the leader of 10 nations that were located to the north. And as we know, God wanted him to be, in fact, the king. Rehoboam was going to mount an attack, in fact, on Jeroboam to bring him down, but God said, no, turn back, this is what I want. And this is necessary. Maybe there was a thought that perhaps that Judah could be saved. And it was for a time. Because remember, Israel went into captivity before Judah did. But 1 Kings, chapter 13 here, just to give you a little more background on this. And so what happens is Jeroboam, to keep people from going down to Jerusalem and having their hearts turned to King Rehoboam and back to Judah, he instituted, it says, a feast in the 8th month. And he set up calf worship in 2 places, one of which was Bethel. And God sent a prophet to prophesy against Saul. And he told the prophet, he said, I want you to do this. He said, when I send you up, I don't want you to eat or drink when you're there or on the way back. He said, I want you to go up one way and go back another. He said, I do not want you to eat or drink. And so that was the instructions the prophet was given, to not eat or drink. In chapter 13 here of 1 Kings, I'm in Chronicles, that's not going to do any good, is it? But in chapter 13 and verse 1, and behold, a man of God went from Judah, so it says to Bethel, by the word of the Eternal. Again, he was told not to eat or drink, go give the prophecy, come back another way. And Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense. So here's Jeroboam here, who has misled Israel, these 10 nations to the north, to worship a calf. He says, in fact, the calf brought them out of Egypt, if you can read the story. And then he cried out, this prophet cried out against the altar by the word of the Eternal and said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a child, Josiah by name, shall be born to the house of David. On you he shall sacrifice the priests of the high places, who burn incense on you, and men's bones shall be burned on you. A terrible prophecy of what was going to happen to this evil Jeroboam. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, this is the sign which the Eternal has spoken. Surely the altar shall split apart, and the ashes on it shall be poured out. And so it came to pass, when King Jeroboam heard the saying of the man of God, who cried out against the altar in Bethel, that he stretched out his hand from the altar, and saying, arrest him. And then his hand, which he had stretched out toward him, withered, so that he could not pull it back to himself again. And you know the story about how Jeroboam asked that God, he entreat God that he be healed, and he was healed here in the story. In verse 6 it talks about that. Verse 7, and then the king said to the man of God, come home with me and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward. I'm going to give you a big reward. Come home with me. But the man of God said to the king, if you were to give me half your house, I would not go with you, nor would I eat bread nor drink water in this place. See, he got the instructions right, didn't he? He got the instructions right. Don't eat in this place. And so it was commanded me by the word of the Lord, saying, you shall not eat bread nor drink water, nor return by the same way. And so he went another way and did not return by the way he came to Bethel. And so here, we know what happened here is he got along the way, and there was a prophet that came to him and said, well, you know, an angel told me that you should come and eat with me. Now, what does this tell you here? Well, it's possible this was a righteous prophet. We don't know, but probably not. But he could be that. But obviously, if he had an angel appear to him, it was a lying angel, which would have been a demon that would have told him. But what happened is the prophet of God, who had said, to Jeroboam, I can't eat in this place, should have said all along the way until he got back, in fact, to Judah, that he could not eat or drink. But because the prophet told him this, he turned in and with this man, and he ate and he drank. And along the way, he was attacked by a lion and killed. And just an interesting story if you haven't read through the whole thing. But I think it just really, again, shows very clearly here what God says we should do. You know, it was such a poignant story too. Is here this lion that had killed him, and the man's donkey stood by his body in the road on the way. And this prophet that had told him to come and eat with him had him buried in Bethel, and asked his sons to bury him there as well. But I think it just demonstrates very clearly, brethren, that a man of God follows instructions. God's particular, isn't he? If he tells you to do something, you better do it. There's a reason for it. You know, perhaps if the man had done what God had told him to do, the lion would not have been there. He would not have tarried with a prophet that said an angel had told him to come and eat with him. And he would have passed by and he would have returned home safely. So, you know, God gave him the instructions. But a true servant of God on a mission follows instructions. You know, we know that Jesus Christ, over in John 17, verse 4, what did he say in his own life? You know, because he was sent on a mission. In John 17, in verse 4, he said, I have glorified you on the earth. As he was praying to the Father, I finished the work. So the Father sent him to do a work. He was sent with instructions to do a work. He says, which you have given me to do. In other words, I've completed my mission. I've followed your instructions. God, I'm now ready to be offered up and to return to you. And so, brethren, I think the very important point here, if I can get this across, this point here of a true servant of God on a mission that has a calling, follows instructions. Number 3 point here is, you notice this, again, it's all through the Bible. In fact, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular one because it's all through the Bible. I mean, you'd have to be blind not to trip over it. And if you were reading through the Scriptures, is a servant of God on a mission and has a calling, is diligent in fulfilling his duties. He's diligent. He's not just fulfills his duty like so many government workers. You know, it's like there was one worker, I don't know whether you heard about him, but he climbed into some place in a jet aircraft recently, and I don't know whether he fell asleep or what happened, and he's making a cell phone call to somebody saying I'm in the airplane. Apparently he was beating on the airplane to get out, you know, but it's amazing how people can do some of the dumbest things. Not too diligent, huh? It's not a good idea to fall asleep in a dangerous place on an airplane that's going to go, 35,000 feet in the air. Not a good idea. But it seems like that people are, today not so diligent. But a servant on a mission is very diligent. Let me give you just a few of examples. Again, this whole thing could be made into a sermon itself. How about Joseph? Very diligent young man. From a young man, he was that way. He rose to second in command in all of Egypt because he was diligent. It seemed like everywhere he went, he was really a go-getter. There was a book we used to read when I was at Ambassador College called The Go-Getter. How many of you have ever read that? Oh, well, you were at Ambassador too, so that's probably where you read it. But Joseph was a go-getter, and that's an interesting story. The go-getter story. That was read to us, by the way, by Dean Blackwell in class. It was like Dean Blackwell's story time. He'd start reading the story to us back in those days. How about Daniel? Here's another example of a diligent man. Again, from a very young man. Not only him, but he associated with young men that were that way too. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were exactly the same way, very diligent. And what happened to Daniel? He was second in command again in 2 empires. And his 3 friends too, they were elevated quite high and were very prominent in those empires as well. Now, Jesus Christ himself, from the time he was 12 years of age, we know at least, he was very diligent. Remember, his family had gone down for the Passover, and I guess they lost track of Jesus on the way back, and they looked and, are you on board? And they found out Jesus was not with them. So they went back searching for him, looking all around, and where did they find him? Was he throwing rocks in the brook down at Kidron? No, he wasn't, was he? But he was conferring, he was talking, to the doctors of the law. He was talking to those that were religious figures, probably people that had some knowledge of the scriptures. He was talking to them, telling them things, and they were, of course, telling him things. Then when his parents come and say, "Where have you been? I've been looking all over creation for you." He said, "Why do you seek me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" Very early age, you see. This was his mentality. He was a go-getter. Well, brethren, are you a diligent person? What if we read the scriptures about Christ, by the way? And you came to this one scripture about, and it was Christ's custom to get up at the crack of dawn and go out and pray. Instead of crack of dawn, by the way, it said the crack of noon. Wouldn't be very inspiring, would it? But we envision people that are leaders, that they're go-getters. Remember Jimmy Carter? I didn't particularly think he was the greatest president. But he made this statement. He said, "I can get up at 9 in the morning," he said, "and be rested. Or I can get up at 6 in the morning and be the president." There is that difference, isn't it? Somebody's a go-getter, a diligent person. Our lifestyle, again, should not be to waste our time, but to be diligent about the time that we have, that our calling be fulfilled. So how careful are you about your time, brethren? God has made no promises to you or me that time will serve us. Sometimes time runs out on us. Are you using the time you have, whether you're older or whether you're younger, to make the most of your calling? To be a go-getter, to be diligent. Number four thing, and a very, very important thing at that, is the servants of God who are on a mission kept themselves from being corrupted by the world and those around them. And you can be somebody who's protecting yourself and keeping yourself from the world without being weird. You don't have to have an attitude of "don't touch me," or walk on eggshells around me. We don't have to be that way. I don't think Daniel was that way. And he was probably around quite a few pretty gritty people through his life. I can't imagine you'd work for any government position where it wouldn't be pretty gritty. Sometimes, probably every manner of evil that he saw. But we as God's people, if we're going to be servants on a mission, brethren, we have to keep ourselves uncorrupted from this world. Let's go over to Genesis 6. Genesis chapter 6 over here. In Genesis chapter 6, in verse 8. Genesis 6 and verse 8. We know the world became quite corrupted during the days of Noah, prior to the flood. But Noah, it says, found grace in the eyes of the Eternal. He found grace in the eyes of the Eternal. And it says, this is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, a perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. You get that one statement there? He walked with God. Now, what does it mean to walk with God? Didn't we already cover that? What did Abraham do to walk with God? He kept his commandments, judgments, and statutes. And that's what Noah did too. He walked with God. And how do you keep yourself from the world, by the way? You walk with God, and you don't get corrupted by the world. And Noah had that trait about himself, that he kept himself uncorrupted from the world and the society that was around him. But verse 11, notice, and the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence, like the world is today. Christ said, as in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. So God looked upon the earth, verse 12, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. See, it was their way that they corrupted. But Noah himself walked with God. And brethren, if we are going to keep ourselves from this world and being tainted and spotted by the world, we've got to be separate from this world. Over in John 17 over here, Jesus says this. In John chapter 17, he says this about the modern day church today, as he said it about the church in 31 AD, in that period of time. But in John 17 and verse 14, he said, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world. Why? Because they're living by the word of God. They're walking with God, even as Noah did, even as Enoch did, and all of the servants of God. And it says, because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. See, Christ was not of the world. He was not of this society that is out here. And it says, I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. Keep them from Satan. But they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them by the truth. And so it's through the truth of God that we're kept clean and uncorrupted as God's people. And so, brethren, it's important for those who are on a mission, have a purpose in life, they're going to be a part of God's family, to keep themselves unspotted from the world. Over in James 1:27, you can just write that one down, but it says, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. There's so many things that can corrupt us in this world and society we're living in. And parents have got to be careful with their children. They send them off to school. They come back with some funny ideas they get in some of the classrooms of today. You know, 2 moms and 2 dads and all kinds of stuff that people are having to to deal with when their kids come home from school. Evolution. We really have to teach our children about what is the truth. Otherwise, again, our children become corrupted right under our noses. And it's happened to people. And of course, you got to watch out also what you allow your children to watch on TV. Particularly today, people utilize the TV as the babysitter for their children. What a bad mistake that is. The old saying, garbage in, garbage out. If we put garbage in our kids' mind, what do we expect them to do? Our kids will tend to mimic what, in fact, we allow them to learn. But Christ's example was not to be a part of the world. We already showed that Elijah was not of the world either. He was not of the world of his time. Noah was not, and all of the servants of God were separate from the world. In fact, when David wrote, he said he did not keep company with those who were evildoers. He didn't run with those kind of people. But he had friendships with people that were godly. And we need to, again, keep our friendships to that. Frankly, all else are nothing more than acquaintances, aren't they, in the world? It seems like the friendships in the world are very ephemeral, short-lived anyway. Can change so dramatically. Number five here is that servants are on a mission that have a calling, brethren, have one quality that is so important. I was talking, by the way, to a gentleman at the gymnasium where I work out, and he's probably, I would imagine he's probably a little older than I am. But he walks a marathon every day. Every day. Tell you, my hat was off to him. I couldn't believe. He does it on a treadmill. That's even more incredible to me. But he's dedicated to that. But when I noticed when he came in to the gym, he was pretty rotund, by the way. He's a big guy, But it seems, I look over every once in a while at him, he's still walking his 26 miles a day. And he gets thinner and thinner. Shrinks, every time I see him. And I'm sure his health has really made a big turnaround. But how do you do that? How do you do that? Takes a lot of grit, doesn't it? Got to grit your teeth, get up and do it every single day. Well, what it takes, brethren, to fulfill a mission and a calling is this one thing: endurance. Endurance. We got to be like old Forrest Gump. Well, how did you do it? I just followed your instructions. And the thing about Forrest Gump is he wouldn't give up. He would not give up. He kept following the instructions. And of course, we know the whole thing is a fictitious story, but very interesting story. And for us, brethren, all we have to do is endure. Endure to the end, is what Jesus said. He that endures to the end, the same is going to be saved. Now, I've often wondered why, I'm still around, quite frankly. There have been so many others through the years, I'm talking about among the ministry, that had so much ability, so much talent. It's just incredulous, some of the people that have passed through the work. And that's interesting. Maybe it describes what they do. They just pass through the work. They're gone now. And the only claim I think I could have is I've just endured. I intend to endure to the very end. I told you when I started this race, I told God, when I gave my life to Jesus Christ, I said, God, I don't know if I can make it across the finish line unless you help me. But I will promise you this, even if I have to crawl across the line, I'll do it. And so I made that promise to God. So that's why I'm here today. And I'll be here, God willing, and something else doesn't happen. I'll be here until the end, hopefully with you, as you endure to the end. And by that I mean, if something didn't happen, I hope I don't die between now and then. But I guess if I do that, I've endured to the end, right? But we are to endure to the end, brethren. And Jeremiah, by the way, the prophet was given the job at a very early age, and Jeremiah didn't think he could do the job. And God said, I've made you a prophet today. And probably one of the greatest prophets that ever lived was Jeremiah. No one like Jeremiah. But, God told Jeremiah, though, once you start on this, don't you back down. He said, I'm going to make your forehead like flint. And he told him, in fact, I'm going to send you to people who won't even listen to you. How'd you like to start a job like that? In reality, sometimes that is what the ministry is. The ministry is talking to a lot of people that don't listen. Now, of course, you're different, right? You and I are different. But God told Jeremiah, look, don't be dismayed, because I will tear you in pieces if you get dismayed. Now, in other words, I'm going to hold you accountable. So, brethren, once we start and embark on this, and I embarked on this about 1968, God says, don't give up. Endure to the end. There's no middle ground to that. You got to endure to the end. And Jesus Christ was an endurer himself. Let's go over to 1 Peter chapter 2. Now, God is calling people with these traits, brethren, these 5 traits. I'm going to give them to you again. Number 1, those who are servants of God, who are called and are on a mission, are loyal to God. They're loyal to God. They're loyal to the laws of God. They're loyal to the church, in fact. They're loyal to one another. Number 2, they follow instructions. God says to do it. They follow the instructions that God has given. Number 3, they're diligent in fulfilling their duties. And number 4, they keep themselves from the corruption of the world. And number 5, they endure to the end. They endure to the end. And what is God going to do with all of that? In you and me, brethren, what is He doing? Again, let's go over to 1 Peter chapter 2 over here. 1 Peter chapter 2 and down in verse 5. Here Peter says, you also as living stones are being built up a spiritual house. You see, if we have these qualities, we're going to be solid stones that can be set in the house that God is building. And not only that, it says a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. In verse 9, it says, for you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, His own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light, who once were not a people, but God has molded us and He's crafted us, brethren, such that we are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. And it says, beloved, I beg you, as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from the fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. So, brethren, let's make sure we are people that are on a mission, a purposeful mission and a purposeful calling. You're living in one of the most exciting times in the history of mankind, in the history of humanity. And brethren, you have an anointing from God. God has called you out of the world. He's anointed you for a job, for a mission, for a calling. And if you follow that calling, He's going to preserve you. We see that again through all of the servants of God, from Lot, who was preserved, from Sodom and Gomorrah, and all of the servants of God that were preserved. David, of course, is another example of it, of one who was faithful that God preserved many times. And God will preserve you and bring you on into His kingdom. And brethren, that's why you've been specially selected by Almighty God. So brethren, live and be people that are on a special mission and calling, because that is our mission. That is our calling.